I will never forget the screams that night. It was piercing, like a blade cutting through the silence of the village. It came from the far end of Okporo, where the widows lived. My heart raced as I stepped out of my hut, clutching my wrapper tightly. Others had gathered too, their faces pale with fear and curiosity. The screams came from Awil's hut. She had been widowed for only a month. Someone was inside her home, and it wasn't a thief. Who could it be? People whispered. The answer came in a shocking flash when Okechukwu, the man everyone called the lover of widows, stumbled out of her door, clutching his chest. He collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air. Everyone stood frozen. It wasn't the sight of him on the ground that shocked us, it was the deep red scratch marks on his face and neck. Awil stood in her doorway, her eyes wide and fearful, her hands trembling as she pointed at him. "He's cursed," she cried. Okechukwu was a man everyone knew but few respected. He was tall, with a charm that drew women to him like flies to honey. But it was no secret that he had a peculiar habit: he sought out widows. Some whispered that he took advantage of their loneliness, offering them false comfort in exchange for their trust and their wealth. Others said he was just a man with no shame. But no one dared confront him. His boldness was unmatched, and he often laughed off the rumors that trailed him. That night, though, Okechukwu's charm failed him. As he lay groaning in the dirt, people muttered, "It is his turn to face the gods." Mama Nkechi, the oldest woman in the village, shook her head. "A man who eats what does not belong to him will choke one day," she said. What happened next shocked us all. Okechukwu began to speak, his voice trembling. "It wasn't her," he said. "It was something else. It grabbed me." The villagers looked at one another, fear spreading like wildfire. What had Okechukwu encountered in Awil's hut? By morning, the whole village knew what had happened. Everyone gathered at the village square, whispering and pointing at Okechukwu, who sat on the ground, his face pale and hollow. Awil stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The elders arrived, their walking sticks thudding against the ground as they took their seats. The village head, Izobiora, raised his hand for silence. "Okechukwu," he began, his deep voice commanding respect. "Tell us what happened last night." Okechukwu hesitated, his eyes darting around as though the answer lay somewhere in the crowd. Finally, he spoke. I was visiting Awil. We were talking, nothing more. But then, something cold wrapped around my neck. I couldn't breathe. I ran outside, and it let go." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "You mean a spirit?" someone called out. Okechukwu nodded slowly. "It was not human," he whispered. Izobiora turned to Awil. "And you, Awil? What do you have to say?" She took a deep breath, her voice steady. "I didn't see anything. But I felt it too. The air grew cold, and my skin prickled. It was as if she trailed off, looking down at her feet." The elders exchanged glances. Something unspoken passed between them. Finally, Mama Nkechi stood. "We must consult the oracle," she declared. "The gods must tell us why this has come to our village." The villagers left the square in groups, their conversations filled with speculation. Some believed Okechukwu was lying to cover his shame. Others were certain he had angered a spirit. I followed my father home, listening to him mutter under his breath. "That man has brought a curse upon us," he said. "He has no respect for the dead or the living." I couldn't help but wonder if he was right. Okechukwu had a reputation for his nighttime visits to the widows' huts. It was no secret. Yet no one had ever confronted him until now. Was it truly a spirit that had attacked him, or was it the consequence of his deeds finally catching up to him? As the day wore on, more stories began to surface. People said Okechukwu had been warned before, that the spirits of the widows' late husbands watched over their wives. But he had laughed it off, claiming he feared no man, living or dead. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of Okechukwu's scratched face haunted me. And deep down, I felt something stirring, a feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever had happened in Awil's hut wasn't just about Okechukwu. It was about all of us. The gods were watching, and they were not pleased. The next morning, the entire village gathered at the shrine of the oracle. The air was thick with tension, and the rustling of palm leaves overhead seemed louder than usual. Okechukwu sat in the center of the gathering, his head bowed. Awil stood nearby, her face calm but her eyes darting nervously. The oracle, a frail but commanding woman named Neoma, emerged from the shrine, her staff thudding against the ground. Her white chalk markings gleamed under the sunlight, and her voice was firm. "The gods have spoken," she declared. Everyone leaned in, eager to hear the verdict. Okechukwu has trespassed where he should not. His actions have disturbed the spirits of the departed, and now they seek justice. The spirit that attacked him was the husband of one he wronged. But this is only the beginning. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Okechukwu looked up, his face pale. "What must I do?" he stammered. Neoma's gaze was cold. "The gods demand retribution. You must confess your wrongs before the village and perform a cleansing ritual. Only then will the spirits be appeased." But I didn't do anything wrong," Okechukwu protested. Mama Nkechi stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You think we don't know what you've been doing? You've preyed on the weak, taken what isn't yours, and laughed in the face of decency. Now you must face the consequences." Okechukwu hung his head, his shoulders slumping. It was clear he had no choice. The confession was scheduled for the next evening, giving Okechukwu time to reflect on his actions. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, another revelation sent shockwaves through the village. A young boy named Chijioke, no more than 10 years old, approached the elders with trembling hands. "I saw something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What did you see, my child?" Isobiora asked, leaning forward. Chijioke swallowed hard. "Last week, I saw Okechukwu enter Mama Ngozi's hut. He didn't leave until the rooster crowed." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Mama Ngozi, a widow known for her kindness, looked stunned. "It's true," she admitted reluctantly. "He came to me, saying he wanted to help me with my farm. But his help came at a price." Okochukwu's head shot up, his eyes wide. "That's a lie," he shouted. But the look on Mama Ngozi's face said otherwise. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions grim. It was clear now that Okochukwu's sins ran deeper than anyone had imagined. And the gods were not done with him yet. The village square was packed that evening. Torches flickered in the dark, casting long shadows on the gathered faces. Okechukwu stood in the center, his head bowed, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cool breeze. Isobiora raised his staff, silencing the crowd. "Okechukwu, speak now. Confess your wrongs before the gods and the people, or bear the wrath of the spirits." Okochukwu's voice trembled as he began. I have wronged the widows of this village. I approached them in their moments of grief, pretending to offer comfort, but my intentions were not pure. I took advantage of their trust, their pain." A murmur swept through the crowd. The widows present exchanged glances, some with anger, others with sadness. Mama Ngozi wiped her eyes with the edge of her wrapper. "I thought I could get away with it," Okechukwu continued. "I thought no one would see. But now, I see that the spirits were watching all along." He fell to his knees, his hands clasped together. "Please, forgive me. I will do whatever it takes to make this right." Mama Nkechi stepped forward, her voice firm. "The gods do not forgive easily, Okechukwu. Your actions have brought shame upon the living and unrest to the dead. You must do more than confess, you must make amends." The elders nodded in agreement. "Tomorrow, the cleansing ritual will begin," Isobiora announced. "And until it is complete, you will not leave the village." The next day, the village was alive with activity. The cleansing ritual was a rare and serious event, and everyone had a role to play. The women fetched water and prepared special herbs, while the men built a large fire in the center of the square. Neoma, the oracle, gave Okechukwu instructions. You will fast for 3 days and spend the nights in the shrine, praying to the gods for forgiveness. During this time, you must not speak to anyone or leave the shrine's grounds. Okechukwu nodded, though fear flickered in his eyes. He had heard stories of others who had undergone similar rituals. Some emerged forgiven and restored, but others, well, no one spoke of what happened to them. As the sun set, the villagers gathered once more. Okechukwu was led to the shrine, a small, thatched structure surrounded by sacred trees. Neoma handed him a calabash filled with bitter herbs. Drink this, she said. It will cleanse your spirit and prepare you for what is to come. He hesitated, then drank, wincing at the sharp taste. The crowd watched in silence as he entered the shrine, the door closing behind him. The villagers dispersed, their whispers carrying into the night. Will the gods forgive him? Someone asked. Okechukwu's answer was grim. That depends on how deeply his wrongs have cut. Inside the shrine, Okechukwu sat alone, the bitter taste still lingering on his tongue. The silence was heavy, and for the first time in years, he felt truly afraid. Inside the shrine, the silence was suffocating. Okechukwu sat cross-legged on the cold, dirt floor, staring at the flickering flame of a single oil lamp. His stomach growled from the fast, but it was the shadows that unnerved him the most. They danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed almost alive. The hours crawled by. At first, the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. But then, just as Okechukwu began to doze, a faint whisper filled the air. Why did you come? His eyes shot open, heart pounding. The voice was low, almost a hiss. He glanced around, but the shrine was empty. Who's there? He called out, his voice shaky. There was no response. Instead, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the air colder. Then, he heard it again, this time clearer. Why did you disturb her peace? Okechukwu scrambled to his feet, pressing his back against the wall. Leave me alone, he shouted. But the voice only laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed around the shrine. Suddenly, the oil lamp flickered violently and went out. Okechukwu was plunged into darkness. The whisper stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Trembling, he sank to the floor, clutching his knees to his chest. For the rest of the night, he did not sleep. By dawn, news of strange noises coming from the shrine had spread through the village. A few villagers claimed they had heard Okechukwu's shouts, while others insisted they saw shadows moving near the shrine's entrance. At the village square, the elders gathered to discuss what had happened. It seems the spirits are restless, said Isobiora, stroking his grey beard. Perhaps Okechukwu's sins are deeper than we thought. Okechi nodded grimly. The spirits are testing him. If his heart is not pure, they will not forgive him. Awil stood nearby, silent but watchful. She had kept her distance since the incident, but now she spoke up. What if the spirits aren't just testing him? What if they are warning us? Her words sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Warning us of what? Someone asked. I don't know, she said, her voice steady. But I think this is bigger than just Okechukwu. As the villagers murmured among themselves, Neoma emerged from the shrine, her expression grave. The gods are not yet satisfied, she announced. Tonight will be harder than the last. Okechukwu must prepare himself. Okechukwu, pale and trembling, nodded. But deep inside, he wondered how much more he could endure. As darkness fell, the villagers gathered outside their homes, watching the shrine from a distance. The air was thick with anticipation. Inside, Okechukwu sat near the extinguished lamp, his back pressed against the shrine wall. His body ached from hunger, but it was fear that gripped him most. Neoma had warned him that the second night would test his resolve. You must remain silent, she had said. No matter what you see or hear, do not leave the shrine. The gods are watching. The first few hours passed in tense silence. But then, just as before, the whispers began. You think you can escape judgment, a voice hissed, sharper this time, closer. Okechukwu clenched his fists, refusing to respond. The air grew colder, and the shadows began to swirl around him, forming vague, shifting shapes. One looked like a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his eyes burning with anger. "You took what was mine," the figure growled. "And now, you will pay." Okechukwu's breath quickened. "It's not real," he muttered under his breath, but the figure moved closer. A cold wind swept through the shrine, snuffing out the faint glow of the lamp. A deep, guttural laugh echoed in the darkness. "Run," the voice taunted. "Run if you dare." Every nerve in Okechukwu's body screamed at him to flee, but he stayed rooted to the spot. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, until they became an unbearable roar. And then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The shadows receded, and the air grew still. But Okechukwu was left trembling, his spirit battered. The next morning, Neoma visited the shrine to check on Okechukwu. She found him huddled in a corner, his face pale and drawn. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with desperation. "They are coming for me," he whispered. Neoma frowned. "What did you see?" Okechukwu hesitated, his voice barely audible. "It was him, one of the husbands. He said I took what was his." Neoma's expression darkened. "The spirits have made their grievance clear. You must make restitution, Okechukwu. If you fail, their wrath will not be contained." Later that day, the elders gathered once more. Neoma shared what she had learned, and the discussion turned serious. "We must act quickly," said Momankechi. "The spirits won't wait forever." The decision was made: Okechukwu would visit the families of the widows he had wronged and offer restitution. He would also build a shrine to honor the spirits he had angered. As the villagers dispersed, Awe lingered behind, her gaze fixed on the distant shrine. "This won't end with Okechukwu," she said quietly. "The spirits are angry at all of us for allowing this to happen." Her words sent a chill through me. Deep down, I knew she was right. The village had turned a blind eye to Okechukwu's deeds for too long. Now, we were all paying the price. When the elders announced that Okechukwu would visit the families of the widows he had wronged, the village erupted into whispers. It was rare for anyone to publicly atone for their sins, and even rarer for someone like Okechukwu, who had always carried himself with pride, to humble himself. On the appointed day, he emerged from the shrine, looking gaunt and weary. The fast had drained him, and the sleepless nights had left dark circles under his eyes. Still, he stood tall, though his steps were slow and uncertain. The first house he visited was Mama Ngozi's. She stood in her doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mixture of anger and pity. "What do you want, Okechukwu?" she asked sharply. He lowered his head. "I came to apologize," he said. "I wronged you, and I'm here to make amends." Mama Ngozi let out a bitter laugh. "You think an apology will fix what you've done? You took advantage of my grief, Okechukwu. You made me feel weak when I needed strength." "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't undo what I've done, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "You can start by helping on my farm. It's harvest season, and I could use the extra hands." Word spread quickly, and as Okechukwu made his way to the next house, villagers began to follow him. Some shouted insults, others watched silently, their expressions unreadable. For the first time, Okechukwu felt the weight of his actions, not just the anger of the spirits, but the pain he had caused the people he lived among. By the end of the day, Okechukwu had visited every widow he had wronged. Each woman had her own demands: tending their farms, repairing their homes, fetching water. The tasks were grueling, but he accepted them without complaint. The village buzzed with talk about Okechukwu's transformation. Some believed he was genuinely repentant, while others were convinced he was only doing it to save himself from the spirit's wrath. As I watched him labor in the scorching sun, I couldn't help but wonder if this was truly enough to appease the gods. The spirits were not easily satisfied, and their warnings had been clear. That night, I couldn't sleep. A strange unease filled the air, as if something unseen was watching us all. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my heart, replaying Awil's words in my mind. This isn't just about Okechukwu, she had said. The village allowed his actions to continue. The spirits will hold us all accountable. The thought made my stomach churn. If she was right, then no one in the village was safe, not until we found a way to truly atone for what we had allowed to happen. As the village settled into an uneasy calm, the signs began to appear. It started with small things, strange footprints near the shrine, chickens disappearing overnight, and an unshakable chill in the air even during the heat of the day. The first major incident happened one morning when Mom Nkechi's clay pot, freshly filled with water from the stream, shattered without warning. The spirits are restless, she said, her voice trembling. This is no coincidence. By evening, more villagers reported strange occurrences. Akuchi's yamban, which had been sturdy and well-built, collapsed suddenly, spilling its contents into the dirt. Namdi's fishing nets were found torn to shreds, even though he swore they had been intact the night before. The elders called a meeting in the village square. Isobiora's face was grave as he addressed the crowd. It is clear the spirits are not yet appeased. Okochukwu's restitution may not be enough. A murmur spread through the gathering. Some villagers suggested more sacrifices, others argued for a larger cleansing ritual. Awil stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. This isn't just about Okochukwu's sins, she said firmly. We all turned a blind eye to what he was doing. The spirits are angry at the entire village for allowing this to happen. Her words struck a chord, and the crowd fell silent. Isobiora nodded slowly. Perhaps she is right. We must ask the oracle what more we must do. The next morning, Neoma entered the sacred grove to consult the gods. The grove was forbidden to most villagers, a place where the air itself seemed heavier with the presence of unseen forces. When she emerged hours later, her face was pale, her eyes wide. The villagers gathered around her, eager for answers. The gods have spoken, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Okechukwu must continue his penance, but it is not enough. The village must come together to perform a communal cleansing. Every man, woman, and child must participate. What kind of cleansing? Someone asked. Neoma hesitated before answering. We must rebuild the shrine to honor the widows and their husbands. It must be the finest structure this village has ever seen. And during its construction, we must abstain from quarrels, greed, and deceit. Only then will the spirits be satisfied. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. It was a daunting task, one that would require unity and sacrifice. But the alternative, a village plagued by the wrath of the gods, was unthinkable. Work began the next day, and for the first time in years, the village moved as one. Men gathered wood and clay, women wove intricate patterns into palm fronds, and children fetched water. Okechukwu worked harder than anyone, his hands blistered and raw from carrying heavy stones. Despite the progress, a lingering tension remained. Would this truly be enough to lift the spirit's anger? Or was there more to come? The villagers worked tirelessly on the shrine, each person contributing in their own way. The elders oversaw the construction, ensuring every detail honored the widows and their late husbands. The air was filled with the sound of hammers striking wood and voices calling out instructions. Okechukwu labored silently, his body sore from days of penance. He carried heavy stones, mixed mud for the walls, and climbed ladders to secure palm fronds for the roof. His once proud demeanor was gone, replaced by quiet determination. Despite the progress, there was unease in the air. Strange things continued to happen. Tools went missing only to reappear in odd places. Freshly laid clay walls crumbled without cause. The villagers whispered among themselves, wondering if the spirits were still displeased. One afternoon, while Okechukwu was laying the foundation, he felt a sudden chill. He looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, a man with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. The figure stared at him, unblinking, before vanishing into thin air. Okechukwu stumbled back, his heart racing. Did anyone see that? He asked, his voice shaking. The others exchanged uneasy glances. See what? One of the men asked. Nothing, Okechukwu muttered, but his hands trembled as he returned to work. That evening, Okechukwu approached Obiora. The old man was sitting under the iroko tree, his staff resting across his lap. I saw something today, Okechukwu confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. A man, or maybe a spirit. He was watching me. Obiora nodded slowly. The spirits are testing you, he said. They want to see if your heart is truly repentant. If you falter, they will know. But I've been working, doing everything they asked, Okechukwu protested. True repentance is not just about action, the elder said. It is about your soul. You must face the pain you caused and truly understand it. Okechukwu left the elder feeling more burdened than before. As he walked back to his hut, he thought about the widows he had wronged. Their faces flashed before his eyes, each one filled with pain and betrayal. That night, sleep eluded him. The shadows in his room seemed to move, whispering words he couldn't understand. He lay awake, wondering if he would ever be free of the spirit's grasp, or if he even deserved to be. The next day, he returned to the shrine with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever the spirits wanted, he would give. Whatever it took, he would endure. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As the shrine neared completion, the unease in the village deepened. Despite the hard work and cooperation, strange events continued to plague the villagers. Livestock went missing, food spoiled inexplicably, and many claimed to hear whispers in the dead of night. On the eve of the shrine's completion, the villagers gathered for an evening meal, hoping to find comfort in each other's company. Okechukwu sat apart, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. He had been working tirelessly, but the whispers in the night still haunted him. That night, the first scream pierced the air. It came from the edge of the village, near Mama Ngozi's hut. Villagers rushed to the scene, torches in hand, only to find Mama Ngozi trembling and pointing toward the forest. I saw him, she cried. My late husband. He stood there, staring at me with those same eyes he had in his final moments. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Could the spirits be appearing to others now? As they murmured among themselves, a second scream came, this time from Namdi's compound. By the time the crowd reached his home, he was standing outside, shaking like a leaf. They are here, he whispered. The spirits, they are everywhere. The crowd fell silent, fear settling over them like a heavy fog. It was clear that something had shifted, and the spirits were no longer content to wait. The next morning, Obiora called an emergency meeting in the village square. His face was grave as he addressed the crowd. The gods are not satisfied, he announced. The spirit's anger is spreading, and it will consume us all if we do not act quickly. What more can we do? Someone shouted. We've built the shrine, worked day and night. What else do they want? Obiora raised a hand to silence the murmurs. The spirits demand a final sacrifice, he said solemnly. A true offering, one that shows our collective repentance. The villagers froze. A sacrifice. What kind? Whose? Neoma stepped forward, her voice steady. The oracle has spoken. It must be a life, given willingly. Only then will the spirits be appeased. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A life. The villagers looked at one another, fear etched on their faces. Okechukwu stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. If it must be someone, let it be me, he said. I am the cause of this. I will face the spirits myself. The villagers stared at him in shock. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if his offer was genuine. Others nodded in quiet agreement, believing it was only fair. Obiora placed a hand on Okechukwu's shoulder. Your courage is noted, he said. But the spirits will decide if your offering is enough. As the villagers dispersed, the weight of the decision hung over them all. Okechukwu spent the rest of the day preparing himself, knowing that by sunrise, his fate would be sealed. The village was quiet that night, more so than usual. Even the crickets seemed to hold their song, as if aware of the gravity of the coming day. Okechukwu sat outside his hut, staring at the sky. The stars seemed farther away, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows on the ground. I couldn't sleep. Like many others, I stayed awake, watching from the safety of my home as Okechukwu prepared for what could be his last night. He didn't seem afraid, though his shoulders were tense. As the hours dragged on, I found myself walking toward him, unsure of what I wanted to say. Okechukwu, I called softly, and he turned to me, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Yes, he replied, his voice steady but tired. Are you sure about this? I asked. You don't have to do it. Maybe there's another way. He shook his head. I've caused too much pain. This is the least I can do. If my life can bring peace to the village, then so be it. There was nothing I could say to change his mind. As I left, I felt a heaviness in my chest. The spirits had taken so much already. Would they truly be satisfied with his sacrifice, or was this just the beginning of something worse? At dawn, the villagers gathered at the shrine. The air was thick with tension, and no one spoke as they waited for the ritual to begin. The shrine stood tall, its intricate carvings glistening with fresh paint. Okechukwu stepped forward, his head bowed. He wore a simple white cloth, a symbol of purity and surrender. Neoma stood beside him, her staff in hand, ready to guide the ritual. The spirits have demanded a life, she announced, her voice firm. Okechukwu has offered himself as a sacrifice. If the spirits accept, peace will return to the village. If they do not, she trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. Okechukwu knelt before the shrine, his hands clasped tightly together. Neoma began chanting, her voice rising and falling like the wind through the trees. The villagers watched in silence, their breaths held. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the torches. The air grew colder, and a low, mournful sound filled the air. The villagers gasped as a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was the same hollow-eyed man Okechukwu had seen before. He stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate, until he stood directly in front of Okechukwu. For a moment, the two stared at each other. Then, without a word, the figure raised a hand and touched Okechukwu's forehead. A bright light flashed, blinding everyone. When the light faded, Okechukwu was lying on the ground, motionless. The figure was gone, and the air was still. What does this mean? Someone whispered, their voice trembling. Neoma knelt beside Okechukwu, her fingers searching for a pulse. When she looked up, her face was pale. He is alive, she said. The spirits have spared him, for now. The villagers erupted into murmurs. The spirits had made their decision, but what it meant was still unclear. Would this be enough, or had the spirits only delayed their wrath? When Okechukwu stirred, his face was pale, and his eyes had a strange, faraway look. The villagers stepped back as he sat up slowly, rubbing his forehead where the spirit had touched him. What did you see? Neoma asked, her voice urgent. Okechukwu hesitated, his gaze unfocused. I saw them. The widows. They were crying, surrounded by their husbands. They said it is not over. The crowd erupted into murmurs. The spirits had spared Okechukwu, but their message was clear, there was more to be done. Isobiora raised his hand for silence. We must not panic. The spirits have given us another chance. But we must move carefully, or their wrath will return. Okechukwu stood shakily, his strength barely holding him up. I will do whatever they ask, he said. Tell me what I must do. Neoma looked at him thoughtfully. The mark on your forehead is a sign. The spirits have chosen you to continue the work. You must seek out the widows you wronged and ask for their forgiveness directly. Only then will the spirits find peace. Okechukwu nodded, though his expression was heavy with dread. Facing the widows would be the hardest task of all. The next morning, Okechukwu began his journey to find the widows. The first was Amina, who lived on the outskirts of the village. Her husband had died mysteriously years ago, and many believed Okechukwu's betrayal had been the final blow to his spirit. Amina was tending to her small farm when Okechukwu approached. She looked up, her expression hardening the moment she saw him. "What do you want?" she asked coldly, standing tall despite her frail frame. Okechukwu knelt before her, his voice trembling. "I have come to beg for your forgiveness. I wronged you and your husband, and I am deeply sorry." Amina stared at him for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sorry," she said finally. "Do you know what your actions cost me? I lost my husband. I lost my peace. And you think sorry can fix that?" "I don't expect it to fix anything," Okechukwu replied, his voice breaking. "But I need you to know that I regret everything I did. If there is anything I can do to make it right, tell me, and I will do it." Amina's eyes softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "Words are easy, Okechukwu. But actions are harder. If you truly mean what you say, you will prove it. Help me with this land, and maybe, just maybe, I will believe you." Okechukwu nodded, rising to his feet. "I will," he promised. For the rest of the day, he walked beside Amina, tilling the soil and planting seeds. His hands blistered, but he didn't complain. By sunset, Amina finally spoke. "Perhaps the spirits were right to spare you," she said quietly. "But you still have a long way to go." Okechukwu left her farm with a small spark of hope. It was the first step on a long journey, but it was a step forward nonetheless. Okechukwu's next visit was to Nkem, a widow who had been one of the loudest voices against him during the village's meetings. Her late husband had been a respected farmer, and his sudden death had left her struggling to provide for her 3 children. Nkem was sitting outside her hut, weaving a basket, when Okechukwu arrived. Her children played nearby, their laughter breaking the quiet of the morning. The moment she saw him, her face darkened. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, setting her work aside. "I've come to ask for your forgiveness," Okechukwu said, kneeling before her. "I wronged you and your husband, and I know I don't deserve your mercy. But I am truly sorry." Nkem laughed bitterly. "Sorry? Do you think your apology will bring my husband back? Do you think it will fill the empty stomachs of my children?" "I know it won't," Okechukwu replied, his voice steadied despite the sting of her words. "But I want to help you, if you let me. I want to ease your burden, even if just a little." Nkem stood, her hands on her hips. "You can't undo the damage you've done, Okechukwu. But if you're serious, I won't stop you from trying. There's firewood to chop and water to fetch. Let's see if you're as repentant as you claim." Okechukwu got to work immediately. He carried heavy bundles of firewood from the forest, his muscles straining with each step. He made countless trips to the river, filling her water pots until his arms ached. By the end of the day, he was exhausted, but Nkem still wasn't satisfied. "You think one day of work can make up for years of pain?" she asked, her voice sharp. "No," Okechukwu said, meeting her gaze. "But I keep coming back until you believe me." Nkem said nothing, but the faintest hint of surprise flickered in her eyes. As Okechukwu walked away, he realized this journey would be even harder than he had imagined. The third widow, Edeora, was known for her quiet nature. Unlike Amina and Nkem, she rarely spoke of her late husband or the struggles she faced after his death. Her silence made her difficult to approach, but Okechukwu knew he couldn't avoid her. Edeora was sitting outside her hut, grinding maize, when he arrived. She looked up briefly but said nothing as he approached. "Good afternoon, Edeora," Okechukwu said, his tone cautious. She nodded in response but didn't stop her work. "I've come to ask for your forgiveness," he said, kneeling before her. "I wronged you, and I'm deeply sorry." Edeora paused, her hands resting on the grinding stone. For a moment, it seemed like she might speak, but then she resumed her task without a word. "Please," Okechukwu continued, his voice earnest. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to make amends. Tell me how I can help you." Edeora finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Help me grind this maize," she said simply. Okechukwu nodded and sat beside her, taking over the grinding stone. The task was repetitive and exhausting, but he didn't complain. As the hours passed, Edeora watched him silently, her face giving away nothing. When they finished, she stood and began to gather the maize into sacks. "Come back tomorrow," she said softly before disappearing into her hut. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Okechukwu left her compound feeling a small sense of relief. For the first time, he felt like he was truly beginning to atone for his past. The next day, Okechukwu returned to Edeora's hut as promised. She was outside, sweeping the compound, her children playing quietly nearby. She barely acknowledged his arrival but handed him a bundle of tools. "You will help me tend the farm today," she said, her tone neutral. Without hesitation, Okechukwu followed her to her farmland. The plot was small but overgrown with weeds. Edeora showed him where to start, and he got to work immediately. The sun blazed overhead, and sweat poured down Okechukwu's face as he pulled weeds and tilled the soil. Edeora worked alongside him in silence, her movements efficient and practiced. Despite her quiet demeanor, her presence was commanding, and Okechukwu found himself working harder to prove his sincerity. As the day wore on, he noticed her children bringing water to the field. They were shy, watching him with curious eyes but saying nothing. Okechukwu smiled at them, but they quickly hid behind their mother. When the work was done, Edeora stood back and surveyed the field. "You've done well today," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But this is only the beginning. If you truly want forgiveness, you must show it through consistency." "I will," Okechukwu promised, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "I come back every day if I have to." Edeora gave him a long, thoughtful look before nodding. "We'll see." As Okechukwu walked back to the village, he felt a flicker of hope. Edeora's words weren't forgiving, but they weren't dismissive either. It was a step forward, and he was determined to keep moving in the right direction. Word of Okechukwu's efforts began to spread through the village. People talked about how he worked on Amina's farm, fetched water from Kem, and now labored tirelessly for Edeora. Opinions were divided. Some believed he was truly repentant, while others thought it was too late for redemption. I overheard many of these conversations as I moved through the village. The elders seemed particularly skeptical, but a few younger villagers spoke of giving him a chance. "Okechukwu is trying," one man said. "At least he's doing something." How many of us would be brave enough to face our mistakes like that? Others scoffed. "He brought this upon himself. Let him suffer. The spirits will judge if it's enough." Despite the mixed reactions, Okechukwu continued his work. I often saw him carrying firewood, hauling water, or toiling in the fields. His once proud demeanor was gone, replaced by quiet determination. One evening, I visited Neoma to ask her thoughts. She was sitting outside her hut, preparing herbs for the next village ritual. "What do you think of Okechukwu's efforts?" I asked. She paused, her hands stealing over the leaves. "The spirits are watching," she said simply. "They will decide if his actions are enough." Her words gave me little comfort, but they stuck with me. The village was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And though Okechukwu was making progress, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits had more in store for him, and for all of us. Okechukwu's journey of atonement was far from over. Each widow's forgiveness seemed to bring new challenges, and the weight of his past mistakes hung heavy over the village. As the days passed, it became clear that the spirit's wrath wouldn't be so easily appeased. Okechukwu approached his fourth widow, Uju, with caution. Unlike the others, Uju was known for her fiery temper and sharp tongue. Her husband had been a respected palm wine tapper who died in an accident many believed was tied to Okechukwu's betrayal. When Okechukwu arrived at her compound, Uju was pounding yam in a large mortar, her movements aggressive and deliberate. She looked up and frowned when she saw him. "What do you want here?" she snapped, not pausing her work. "I've come to ask for your forgiveness," Okechukwu began, lowering himself to his knees. "I know I've hurt you deeply, and I'm here to make amends." Uju dropped the pestle and walked closer, her hands on her hips. "Make amends?" Do you think you can undo the pain you caused with some fancy words and fake humility? No, I can't undo the past, Okechukwu admitted, his voice trembling. But I want to do whatever I can to help you now. Please, give me a chance to prove I've changed. Uju stared at him for a long moment before laughing bitterly. Help me. You're nothing but trouble, Okechukwu. But if you're so eager, start by cleaning that chicken coop. She pointed to a filthy, smelly structure in the corner of her compound. Without hesitation, Okechukwu rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The stench was unbearable, but he pushed through, determined to show Uju he was sincere. By the time he finished, his clothes were filthy, and his body ached. Uju watched him silently, her expression unreadable. You did the work, she said finally, but forgiveness isn't something you can earn in a day. Don't think this changes anything. Okechukwu nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. I'll come back tomorrow, he said simply. As he left her compound, I couldn't help but admire his perseverance. But I wondered if Uju would ever soften. As Okechukwu continued his journey of atonement, the village grew more divided. Some villagers saw his efforts as genuine and believed he deserved a chance to redeem himself. Others, however, remained skeptical, convinced his actions were too little, too late. At the market, I overheard a heated debate between two elders. People can change, Elder MBA argued. The spirit spared him for a reason. We should give him a chance. Elder Okporo shook his head. Change. A man like Okechukwu doesn't change. He's only doing this because he's afraid of the spirit's wrath. It's not true repentance. Their words echoed the conversations happening all over the village. Even the widows Okechukwu had wronged seemed unsure of his sincerity. I decided to visit Amina to see how she felt. She was in her farm, planting yams, when I arrived. Okechukwu works hard, she admitted when I asked her. But hard work doesn't erase what he did. Forgiveness is not something that comes easily. Later, I spoke to Nkem, who was equally cautious. He comes here every day to help, she said. But forgiveness? That's a different matter entirely. The scars he left don't heal overnight. Despite the doubts, Okechukwu pressed on. Every day, he worked tirelessly for the widows, his once proud demeanor replaced by quiet humility. The village watched and waited, unsure of what the spirits would do next. And though Okechukwu's actions were commendable, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of his journey was still ahead. The spirits had spared him for a reason, but forgiveness, true forgiveness, was something no one could guarantee. One quiet evening, as Okechukwu rested in his hut after a long day of work, a knock sounded on his door. It was unusual, most of the villagers still avoided him, unwilling to associate with someone so disgraced. Opening the door, he was surprised to see Chika, the son of Uju, standing there. The boy looked no older than 10 and held a small bundle in his hands. What is it, Chika? Okechukwu asked, crouching to meet his eyes. My mother sent this, Chika said, handing him the bundle. Inside were roasted yam slices and a calabash of palm oil. She said you might need food after all the work you did today. Okechukwu was stunned. Uju, who had been so harsh and unforgiving, had thought of him. Thank you, he said softly. Chika lingered at the doorway, shifting nervously. Why are you helping my mother? He finally asked. She says you're a bad man, but you've been working so hard. Okechukwu sighed, his heart heavy. I hurt your mother and many others in the village. I'm trying to make up for my mistakes. I don't expect her to forgive me, but I want to help however I can. Chika studied him for a moment before nodding. She says you clean the goat shed tomorrow, he said before running off into the night. Okechukwu sat down, staring at the food in his hands. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a small crack in Uju's hardened heart. And for the first time, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. As the days passed, Okechukwu's routine became familiar to the villagers. Each morning, he would visit one of the widows, work tirelessly, and return home in the evening. The widows were slowly warming to his efforts, though none had yet spoken of forgiveness. One evening, as I walked home from the stream, I saw an old man sitting by the path. His face was lined with age, and his eyes seemed to see far beyond the present. He beckoned me over with a crooked finger. "You've been watching him, haven't you?" the old man asked, his voice raspy but firm. "Watching who?" I asked, though I knew he meant Okechukwu. "The man trying to undo his sins," the old man said. "Tell me, do you think the spirits are done with him?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "He's trying his best," I said finally. "But the spirits? I don't know what they want." The old man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The spirits are patient, but they don't forget. He may work himself to the bone, but he cannot escape their judgment. You should tell him to be careful." Before I could respond, the old man stood and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine as his words echoed in my mind. When I told Okechukwu about the encounter the next day, he nodded solemnly. "I know the spirits are watching," he said. "But I won't stop. Even if their judgment comes, I have to face it." His determination was admirable, but I couldn't shake the unease the old man's warning had stirred within me. Something told me Okechukwu's trials were far from over. One morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, the village woke to an eerie silence. The usual sounds of birds chirping and goats bleating were absent. It was as though the world held its breath. I went to fetch water from the stream and found other villagers gathered there, murmuring uneasily. "Have you noticed how quiet it is?" someone asked. "It feels wrong," another whispered. When I returned home, I saw Okechukwu heading toward Uju's compound. His face looked more worn than usual, as though the weight of his efforts was beginning to take its toll. The strange silence persisted throughout the day, and by evening, dark clouds gathered over the village. A fierce wind swept through, bending trees and scattering leaves. The widows lit fires in their compounds, huddling their children close. In the middle of the night, a loud crash echoed through the village. I bolted upright, my heart racing. Rushing outside, I saw that a massive Iroko tree had fallen near the central square, its roots exposed as if torn by an unseen force. The villagers gathered around the fallen tree, their faces pale with fear. "The spirits are angry," someone whispered. Okechukwu appeared, his expression grim. He stepped closer to the tree, running his hand over its bark. "This is a sign," he said softly. "They are reminding me that my path isn't finished." The elders, including Neoma, exchanged uneasy glances. "You've disturbed the balance, Okechukwu," Neoma said. "The spirits are watching closely now. Be careful with your next steps." As the villagers dispersed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, something far greater than any of us could understand. The days following the storm were tense. The fallen Iroko tree became a symbol of the spirit's displeasure, and villagers began avoiding Okechukwu even more than before. Okechukwu continued his work undeterred. He spent most of his days at Uju's compound, cleaning, fixing, and tending to the farm. Uju's icy demeanor began to thaw, though she still maintained her distance. One afternoon, as Okechukwu repaired the fence around Uju's goat shed, I approached him. "Do you feel it?" I asked. "The tension in the air." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "I feel it," he admitted. "But I don't know what more I can do. I've apologized, I've walked, and I've tried to show them I've changed. But it feels like the spirits are waiting for something more." "What could they want?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "Maybe it's not about what I do for the widows. Maybe it's about what I do for myself." His words stayed with me as I watched him work. The villagers were beginning to notice the change in him, but the spirits seemed to demand something deeper, something that even Okechukwu himself couldn't yet see. That night, as I lay awake listening to the restless wind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit's final test was near. Whatever it was, it would either redeem Okechukwu or seal his fate forever. The Festival of Ancestral Spirits, an annual celebration to honor the village ancestors, was fast approaching. It was a time when the villagers sought blessings and guidance, and it was believed that the spirits communicated most clearly during this period. The preparations began with fervor. Women wove colorful baskets, children practiced dances, and the men gathered firewood for the large bonfire. However, there was an unspoken tension in the air, and many avoided discussing the fallen Iroko tree or Okechukwu's ongoing penance. Okechukwu, however, saw the festival as an opportunity. If the spirits will speak, maybe they'll finally tell me what I need to do to find peace, he said one evening as he walked on a new roof for Amina's kitchen. The villagers were divided on whether Okechukwu should even participate in the festival. Some elders felt his presence might anger the spirits further. Others believed his inclusion was necessary for his redemption. On the night of the festival, the village square was alive with light and music. Drums echoed through the air, and the people danced, their colorful attire shining in the firelight. Okechukwu stood at the edge of the square, unsure if he was welcome. But to everyone's surprise, Neoma, the eldest widow, approached him. "Come," she said simply, gesturing toward the circle of dancers. The villagers watched in silence as Okechukwu stepped forward. He moved awkwardly at first, but soon his steps fell in rhythm with the drums. As the night wore on, the drumming stopped abruptly, and a hush fell over the crowd. A cold wind swept through the square, extinguishing several torches. Then, in the flickering light, a figure emerged, a masked dancer representing the spirits. The figure pointed directly at Okechukwu. "Your journey is not complete," the voice boomed. "The spirits demand the truth. Only then will balance be restored." Okechukwu's face paled as the figure retreated into the shadows. The villagers whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. What truth were the spirits demanding? The morning after the festival, the village elders convened a meeting under the ancient baobab tree. The spirit's message had been clear, but its meaning remained a mystery. Neoma began the discussion. The spirits demand the truth. What could they mean? The truth could be about his past deeds, Elder Okporo suggested. Perhaps he hasn't confessed everything. But Okechukwu has worked tirelessly to make amends, Elder MBA countered. Maybe the spirits seek something else. As the debate continued, Okechukwu was summoned to join the gathering. He arrived with his head bowed, his once proud demeanor replaced by quiet humility. The spirits have spoken, Neoma said. What truth are they asking for? Okechukwu hesitated, his eyes darting between the elders. I've confessed my wrongs to the widows, he said. I've asked for their forgiveness and worked to make amends. I don't know what more the spirits want from me. Elder Okporo leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Is there anything you've hidden? Anything you've left unsaid? Okechukwu opened his mouth to respond but stopped. His face tightened, and for a moment, he looked like a man carrying a heavy burden. There is one thing, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The elders leaned closer, the weight of his words hanging in the air. What is it? Neoma asked. Okechukwu took a deep breath. There was a widow I wronged long ago. But she left the village before I could make amends. Her name was Adan. The revelation sent a ripple through the gathered elders. Adan was beloved by the spirits, Neoma said. If she hasn't forgiven you, the spirits will not rest. Okechukwu nodded solemnly. I will find her, no matter how far I have to go. And with that, the next chapter of his journey began. The morning after his confession, Okechukwu prepared for his journey to find Adan. The village buzzed with whispers about his revelation. Adan had left many years ago under mysterious circumstances, and no one knew where she had gone. I watched as he packed his small bag with food and water. His face was tense but determined. Do you think you'll find her? I asked, breaking the silence. I must, he said simply. If she is the key to my redemption, I can't stop now. Before leaving, Okechukwu visited Neoma. The old widow placed her hands on his shoulders. The spirits will guide you, she said. But remember, this path will not be easy. You must be prepared for whatever truths you uncover. With that, Okechukwu set off, walking down the narrow path that led out of the village. The last thing I saw was his figure disappearing into the horizon. The journey was long and filled with uncertainty. Days turned into weeks as he moved from one village to another, asking for any news of Adan. Most people shook their heads, unfamiliar with the name. Finally, in a small village by the river, Okechukwu met an old woman who remembered Adan. She lived here for some time, the woman said, pointing toward a distant hill. But she left again a few years ago. They say she went to the town across the river. The news gave Okechukwu hope. He thanked the woman and continued on his way, determined to find Adan and seek her forgiveness. When Okechukwu arrived in the bustling town across the river, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. The streets were filled with traders, children playing, and the constant hum of voices. He stopped at a small stall, buying a roasted plantain to quench his hunger. "I'm looking for someone named Adan," he told the vendor, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes. "Do you know her?" The man squinted, thinking. "There's an Adan who sells fabrics at the market," he said. "She's been here a few years." Okechukwu's heart leapt. "Where can I find her?" The vendor pointed toward a large marketplace at the center of the town. Okechukwu thanked him and hurried in the direction he had indicated. The market was chaotic, with colorful fabrics, fresh produce, and loud bargaining voices filling every corner. After searching for hours, he finally found her, a woman with a kind face and tired eyes, arranging bolts of fabric on a wooden stand. "Adan," he called softly, his voice trembling. She turned, her face freezing as she recognized him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adan narrowed her eyes. "Okechukwu," she said, her tone sharp. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," he said, stepping closer. "To ask for your forgiveness." Adan folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "You've come a long way," she said. "But forgiveness isn't something I can give so easily." The weight of her words hung between them as Okechukwu realized that his journey was far from over. Adan stared at Okechukwu for what felt like an eternity. Her eyes were guarded, but they also carried a deep pain that Okechukwu couldn't ignore. "Why now?" she asked finally. "Why come all this way after so many years?" "I had no choice," Okechukwu replied, his voice earnest. "The spirits have demanded the truth and forgiveness. I've wronged you, Adan, and I cannot rest until I make things right." Adan laughed bitterly. "Make things right? Do you know what I endured because of you? You think a simple apology can erase the past?" Okechukwu looked down, ashamed. "I don't expect it to. But I'm here to face whatever I must to earn your forgiveness." Adan took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly. "Do you even know what you did to me, Okechukwu?" He nodded slowly. "I do. I took advantage of your vulnerability. I disrespected your trust and left you to carry the burden alone." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "You ruined my name in the village. I left because I couldn't bear the shame. And when I needed you most, you disappeared." Okechukwu stepped closer. "I was a coward. I see that now. And I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make amends." Adan stared at him, her expression unreadable. "If you're serious about this, then you'll have to prove it," she said. "But don't think it will be easy." Okechukwu nodded solemnly. "I'll do whatever you ask." Adan didn't trust Okechukwu, and she made it clear from the start. "Words mean nothing to me," she said. "If you truly want forgiveness, you'll have to show me through your actions." "What must I do?" Okechukwu asked. She led him to her small compound, where she lived alone. The roof of her house was leaking, and the walls were cracked. "You'll help me fix this place," she said. "And you'll do it without complaint." Okechukwu nodded, rolling up his sleeves. He spent the next few days repairing Adan's house. He patched the roof with palm fronds, reinforced the walls with mud, and cleaned the yard until it was spotless. As he walked, Adan watched him carefully, offering no praise or encouragement. She seemed to be waiting for him to falter, but Okechukwu remained steadfast. One evening, as he rested after a long day, Adan approached him with a bowl of food. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, her tone softer than before. "I'm doing this because I've changed," Okechukwu said. "And because I owe you more than I can ever repay." Adan sat down beside him, her gaze distant. "You've done well so far. But forgiveness isn't just about hard work. It's about understanding the pain you caused." "I understand," he said quietly. "Do you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I carried that pain for years. Alone." Okechukwu lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. He knew he had much to learn, and Adan's words only deepened his resolve to make things right. As the days turned into weeks, Okechukwu continued his work at Adan's compound. The house was now steady, the yard clean, and even the small vegetable garden she had abandoned was thriving again. But Adan remained distant, her walls as unyielding as ever. One evening, as they sat under the stars, she finally spoke of her pain. "You think fixing my house will fix the damage you caused, but it's not that simple," she began. Okechukwu looked at her, his heart heavy. "Then tell me how I can repair what I broke." Adan hesitated, her hands clasped tightly together. "Do you remember the child?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Okechukwu froze, his breath catching in his throat. "The child?" "Yes," she said, her tone sharper now. "The one you ignored. The one who bore the weight of our mistakes before he even had a chance to live." Tears welled up in her eyes as she continued. "I was pregnant, Okechukwu. And when the rumor spread, and the shame became unbearable, I had no one to turn to. You abandoned me. I lost that child because I couldn't care for him alone." The word struck Okechukwu like a hammer. He had always suspected, but hearing it now made the truth unbearable. "Adan, he trailed off, unable to find the right words. She stood, her voice trembling with anger and grief. "Do you know what it's like to bury a child? To be blamed for everything while the man who ruined you walks free. You don't deserve my forgiveness." Okechukwu sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words crushing him. He realized that seeking forgiveness wasn't enough, he had to truly confront the pain he had caused and find a way to honor the life that had been lost. The following morning, Okechukwu sought out Adan, but she was nowhere to be found. He spent hours searching the town, asking anyone who might have seen her. Finally, he found her sitting by the river, staring into the water. "Adan," he called softly, approaching her. She didn't turn around. "What do you want, Okechukwu? Haven't you done enough?" "I want to listen," he said, sitting beside her. "Please, tell me everything. I need to understand." Adan hesitated, then took a deep breath. "After you left, the whispers in the village grew louder. People called me names, said I was cursed. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought maybe the child would be my redemption. But as the months went on, the shame became unbearable." Her voice cracked as she continued. "I tried to hide my pregnancy, but the women in the market noticed. They stopped talking to me. Even the midwives refused to help. I had no one. And when the child was born prematurely," she paused, wiping her tears, "I buried him under a tree by my old house, alone." Okechukwu's throat tightened, his own tears threatening to fall. "I failed you," he said. "I failed him. And I can never make that right." Adan turned to him, her eyes blazing. "No, you can't. But you can carry his memory with you. You can make sure that no one else suffers because of your actions." Okechukwu nodded, his heart heavy with guilt and resolve. "I'll honor his memory, Adan. I promise." For the first time, her expression softened. "We'll see if you keep that promise." The river flowed gently beside them, a quiet witness to the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Okechukwu returned to Adan's compound with a heavy heart. Her story played over and over in his mind. He had wronged not only Adan but also the innocent life they had created. For the first time, he fully understood the depth of her pain. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the small yard, staring at the stars, thinking about the child he never met. Adan's words echoed in his mind, "You can carry his memory with you." When Adan joined him the next morning, her face was calm but weary. "You said you wanted to prove yourself," she began. "Now is your chance." "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady. "You will return to our village," she said. "You will go to the place where I buried my child. And you will make it a place of remembrance. Let the villagers see the truth of what happened. Let them know my pain, your betrayal, and the life that was lost because of it." Okechukwu hesitated. The thought of facing his village, of exposing his guilt so openly, filled him with dread. But he knew she was right. "I do it," he said firmly. Adan nodded. "I will go with you. This is a burden we both carry." The decision was made, and preparations began. As they packed for the journey, the tension between them began to ease. They spoke little, but their shared purpose brought a quiet understanding. Okechukwu knew the path ahead would be difficult, but he also knew it was the only way to truly make amends. The journey back to the village was quiet. Adan and Okechukwu walked side by side, each lost in their thoughts. The closer they got, the more Okechukwu's anxiety grew. He hadn't seen the villagers since his shameful departure, and he feared their reactions. When they arrived at the village gates, the familiar sights and sounds stirred memories in both of them. A few villagers stopped to stare, their expressions a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Is that Adan?" someone whispered. "And Okechukwu? What are they doing here together?" Ignoring the murmurs, Adan led the way to the outskirts of the village, to the old tree where she had buried her child. The area was overgrown with weeds, the ground uneven and neglected. "This is the place," Adan said, her voice heavy with emotion. Okechukwu knelt by the tree, placing his hand on the rough bark. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. Adan stood behind him, her arms crossed. "Sorry won't bring him back. But it's a start." They spent the rest of the day clearing the area. Adan directed Okechukwu as he walked, cutting back the weeds and placing stones to mark the spot. By evening, the small grave was clean and dignified, a simple but powerful reminder of the life that had been lost. As they stood in silence, a few villagers gathered, curious about what was happening. Adan turned to them and said, "This is the grave of my child. A child who never had a chance because of lies, shame, and abandonment." The crowd murmured, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding. For the first time, Okechukwu saw the full weight of what he had done reflected in their eyes. The villagers' murmurs grew louder as more people gathered around the grave. Adan's words hung heavily in the air. Okechukwu could feel their eyes on him, some filled with pity, others with disdain. Adan's voice was firm as she continued, "This grave belongs to my son, whose father left us when we needed him most. He abandoned his responsibility, and I carried the shame alone." Okechukwu stepped forward, his head bowed. "It's true," he said. "I am the one who failed her and our child. I was selfish and cowardly, and my actions caused pain that cannot be undone. I stand here today to confess my sins and ask for forgiveness, not just from Adan, but from this community." The crowd was silent for a moment, then the whispers started again. "He's finally admitting it," someone said. "But is it enough?" An elder stepped forward, leaning on his walking stick. It was Chief Nofa, the oldest man in the village. His voice was steady as he addressed Okechukwu. "It takes courage to admit your wrongs, but words alone cannot heal the wounds you caused. What will you do to make this right?" Okechukwu looked at the grave, then at Adan. "I will dedicate myself to honoring this child's memory and supporting Adan in any way she needs. I know I can't undo the past, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it." Chief Nofa nodded slowly. "Let your actions speak for you. The village will be watching." Adan said nothing, but the faintest trace of relief crossed her face. She wasn't ready to forgive, but this moment was a step toward healing. Word spread quickly through the village about Okechukwu's confession. Some villagers were sympathetic, while others remained skeptical. Adan, meanwhile, kept her focus on the grave, ensuring it became a place of dignity and remembrance. Okechukwu spent the next few days helping Adan plant flowers around the grave and building a small wooden bench under the tree. He worked tirelessly, refusing to rest until everything was perfect. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Adan finally spoke. "You've done well here," she said, her tone softer than usual. Okechukwu paused, surprised. "Thank you, Adan. It means a lot to hear you say that." She sighed, brushing dirt from her hands. "But this is only the beginning. You can't just fix a grave and expect everything to be forgiven." "I know," he said. "That's why I want to do more. Tell me what you need, Adan. I'll do whatever it takes." Adan looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What I need is peace. And I don't know if you can give me that." "I'll try," Okechukwu said earnestly. "I'll do everything in my power to help you find it." Adan nodded slowly, but her guard remained up. She had spent years building walls around her heart, and she wasn't ready to let them down just yet. As they finished their work for the day, Okechukwu realized that his journey of redemption was far from over. The grave was just the beginning. The true challenge would be earning Adan's trust and forgiveness. A few days later, Chief Nwafa called for a village meeting. The matter of Okechukwu's confession had become the talk of the town, and many felt the need to address it formally. Adan was hesitant to attend, but Okechukwu convinced her. "We need to face them together," he said. "Let me take responsibility for what I did." The village square was packed by the time they arrived. Men, women, and children gathered around as Chief Nwafa raised his hand to call for silence. "We are here to discuss a matter that has affected one of our own and, by extension, our entire community," he began. He turned to Adan. "My daughter, you have carried this burden for too long. Today, we seek to understand how the village can support you and ensure justice is served." Adan stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "I want the truth to be known, and I want this grave to be a reminder that actions have consequences. But more than anything, I want change. The shame women are made to carry alone must end." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, especially from the women in the crowd. Chief Nwafa nodded. "Your point is valid. As a community, we must do better. And you, Okechukwu," he said, turning to the man who stood with his head bowed, "what do you propose as restitution for the harm you caused?" Okechukwu stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I will dedicate my life to making amends. I will work for Adan, support her in whatever way she needs, and contribute to this village as a whole. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to show through my actions that I've changed." The crowd was silent, and then an older woman spoke. "Let his actions speak," as the chief said. "We will watch, and we will judge." The meeting ended with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Okechukwu knew he had been given a chance, but the road ahead was long and uncertain. Okechukwu threw himself into work. Beyond tending to the grave, he began volunteering around the village. He helped repair broken fences, carried water for elderly villagers, and even assisted in the fields during harvest. At first, many villagers treated him coldly, their eyes filled with judgment. But over time, some began to soften. "Maybe he really has changed," one woman said as she watched him mend a roof. Adan remained cautious. While she appreciated his efforts, she wasn't ready to trust him fully. One evening, she confronted him. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. "Is it guilt? Or are you just trying to look good in front of the villagers?" "It's not about them," Okechukwu replied. "It's about you. And him." He gestured toward the grave. "I can't change the past, but I can try to make the future better." Adan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. But don't think for a second that your work here is done." As the days turned into weeks, Okechukwu found himself becoming a part of the community again. The children no longer ran away when they saw him, and the elders began to greet him with cautious nods. Adan, too, seemed to let down her guard, if only slightly. They began to share small conversations while walking, their old familiarity slowly resurfacing. For the first time in years, Okechukwu felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of truly making things right. The village's annual festival was approaching, a time of celebration, unity, and reconciliation. This year, the elders decided to use the festival as an opportunity to address the theme of forgiveness and accountability, inspired by the events surrounding Okechukwu and Adan. When Chief Nofa informed Adan of the plan, she was hesitant. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive," she admitted. The chief nodded thoughtfully. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting or excusing what was done. It is a step toward freeing yourself from the pain. But the choice is yours. The festival day arrived, and the entire village was abuzz with excitement. Colorful decorations adorned the square, and the air was filled with the aroma of roasted yam, spicy stew, and fresh palm wine. Okechukwu spent the morning helping the women set up tents and assisting the drummers with their instruments. Though some villagers still watched him with wary eyes, most had begun to accept his presence. As the festivities began, Chief Nofa stood in the center of the square to address the crowd. "Today, we celebrate our unity as a community. But we must also remember that unity comes with responsibility. We are here not just to forgive but to learn and grow together." He gestured for Adan and Okechukwu to join him. Adan hesitated but eventually stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Adan," the chief said, "you have carried the weight of pain and betrayal. Do you have anything to say?" She took a deep breath and faced the crowd. "I have lived with anger and sadness for a long time. I cannot say that I am ready to forgive completely, but I am willing to try. Not just for Okechukwu, but for myself." The crowd murmured in approval. Chief Nofa turned to Okechukwu. "And you? Do you understand the importance of this moment?" Okechukwu nodded, his voice steady. "I do. And I will continue to prove through my actions that I am worthy of this chance." The chief smiled. "Then let this festival mark the beginning of healing for all of us." As the drummers began to play, the villagers erupted into song and dance. Children ran around, their laughter filling the air, while elders clapped along to the rhythm. Adan stood at the edge of the square, watching the celebration with a mix of emotions. Okechukwu approached her cautiously. "May I have this dance?" he asked, holding out his hand. Adan hesitated, her pride and pain warring within her. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw a sincerity she hadn't noticed before. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. They stepped into the center of the square, drawing cheers and applause from the villagers. It was a simple dance, tentative at first, but as the rhythm picked up, they moved more freely. For a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the hope of something new. As the night wore on, Adan found herself laughing, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. Okechukwu smiled, grateful for even this small step forward. When the music ended, Adan looked at him, her expression serious. "This doesn't mean everything is forgiven," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "But it's a start." For the first time, Adan felt a glimmer of hope, not for their relationship, but for her own healing. The journey wasn't over, but she was no longer walking it alone. The festival left a strange calm in the village. For days after, people spoke of Adan's courage and Okechukwu's humility. Yet, for Okechukwu, this calm was fleeting. One afternoon, as he fetched water from the stream, he overheard a group of young men speaking in low voices. "It's all an act," one of them said. "Men like him don't change. He'll go back to his old ways when no one's looking." Another chimed in, "It's easy to act humble when the whole village is watching." Okechukwu felt a surge of anger but quickly suppressed it. He couldn't let their doubts distract him. He knew his actions had to speak louder than their words. The real test came later that week when a young widow, Amoka, approached him. She had heard about his efforts and wanted help repairing her roof. Okechukwu hesitated. He knew the village would watch his every move with her. But Adan, hearing of the request, encouraged him. If you truly want to change, you do what's right, no matter what people think, she said. So Okechukwu went to Amoka's house. He walked quietly and respectfully, refusing her offer of food and leaving as soon as the job was done. Still, the whispers in the village grew louder. Adan noticed his silence at dinner that evening. "What's troubling you?" she asked. "They are talking again," he admitted. "No matter what I do, they think I'm the same man I used to be." Adan looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and firmness. "You can't control what they say. Just stay on the path. In time, they'll see the truth or they won't. What matters is that you see it." One morning, while Okechukwu was tending to the communal farm, an unlikely visitor approached him. It was Neka, one of the village's most outspoken critics of his past behavior. She was known for her sharp tongue and distrust of men like him. "I see you've been working hard," she said, her tone neutral. "I'm trying," Okechukwu replied cautiously, unsure of her intentions. Neka watched him for a moment before speaking again. "Do you know why people don't trust you? It's not just because of what you did to Adan. It's because men like you always seem to get away with everything. You hurt people, and then you move on, leaving others to pick up the pieces." Her words stung, but Okechukwu nodded. "You're right. I can't change the past, but I'm not running away from it anymore. I stay and face whatever judgment comes my way." Neka raised an eyebrow, surprised by his honesty. "Good. Because Adan deserves more than empty promises. If you fail again, I'll be the first to call you out." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Okechukwu to his thoughts. That evening, Adan mentioned Neka's visit. "She told me she spoke to you today," she said. "She doesn't trust me," Okechukwu admitted. "She doesn't trust anyone," Adan replied with a faint smile. "But the fact that she bothered to speak to you at all means you're making progress. Don't let her words discourage you. Let them push you to do better." Okechukwu nodded, silently vowing to keep moving forward, no matter how slow or difficult the journey. Despite Okechukwu's growing efforts, rumors about him reignited when Amoka, the young widow, was seen speaking with him again at the stream. The whisper spread like wildfire through the village, with some insisting he was back to his old ways. "Didn't I tell you he hasn't changed?" one elder muttered. "He'll never learn." Even Neka, who had begrudgingly begun to see his efforts as genuine, appeared skeptical when she overheard the gossip. The mamas soon reached Adan, who decided to confront Okechukwu directly. That evening, she found him repairing a broken fence near the village square. "What's this I hear about you and Amoka?" she asked, her tone firm. Okechukwu sighed heavily. "She only asked for advice about her farm. I told her what tools to use and went on my way. That's all." Adan studied his face, looking for signs of deceit but found none. "You need to be careful," she warned. "People are looking for any excuse to drag your name through the mud." "I know," Okechukwu said quietly. "But I can't avoid helping people just because of what others might say." Adan nodded reluctantly. She couldn't fault his reasoning, but she also couldn't shake the unease the rumors brought. "Just remember, rebuilding trust takes time, and one misstep can destroy everything." Amoka, unaware of the storm brewing around her, decided to address the rumors herself. She approached Chief Norfa during the weekly village council meeting and asked for a chance to speak. Standing before the gathered villagers, she began, "I've heard what people are saying about me and Okechukwu. Let me tell you the truth." The crowd fell silent, eager to hear her side of the story. "Okechukwu helped me fix my roof when no one else would," she said. "When my farm tools broke, he gave me advice. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less." She turned to the women in the crowd. "Why is it that when a widow speaks to a man, people assume the worst? Why do we always bear the weight of suspicion while men are forgiven so easily?" Her words struck a chord, especially among the widows and younger women. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and some even nodded in support. Chief Norfa raised a hand to quiet the gathering. "Thank you for your honesty, Amoka. Let this be a reminder that we should judge actions, not appearances." Okechukwu, who had been standing at the edge of the square, felt a wave of gratitude toward Amoka. For the first time, someone had spoken up on his behalf, and it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Adan, watching from the crowd, felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the village was finally beginning to see the man Okechukwu was trying to become. Okechukwu knew he owed Amoka for standing up for him. Her bravery reminded him that change wasn't just about his actions but also about fostering trust with the people he had wronged. The next morning, he went to her farm carrying a bundle of tools he had repaired himself. When Amoka saw him, she smiled faintly but raised an eyebrow. "Are you here to stir up more rumors?" Okechukwu chuckled nervously. "I came to thank you. These tools should help on your farm. It's the least I can do after what you said at the council meeting." Amoka took the tools, inspecting them with care. "You didn't have to. I spoke the truth because it was the right thing to do." "Still," Okechukwu said, "you didn't have to put yourself in the spotlight like that. I know what people say about widows in this village. It couldn't have been easy for you." Amoka shrugged. "Let them talk. I've learned that their words mean nothing as long as I stay true to myself. Maybe it's time you learn the same." Her words struck a chord with Okechukwu. He realized that while he had been focusing on proving himself to others, what mattered most was staying true to his commitment to change. After that day, Okechukwu began working with Amoka more often. He helped her cultivate her crops and repair her farm equipment, and in return, she taught him about resilience. Their partnership raised eyebrows, but neither of them cared. Amoka's boldness inspired Okechukwu, and her unwavering confidence helped him deal with the lingering suspicion in the village. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Amoka said, "You know, if you keep doing the right thing, people will have no choice but to see the truth. But that doesn't mean they'll apologize for doubting you." Okechukwu nodded. "I've stopped waiting for apologies. I just want to keep moving forward." Adan, observing from a distance, felt a mixture of emotions. She was glad to see Okechukwu growing as a person, but a small part of her wondered what it meant for their future. Later that evening, she approached Okechukwu at the communal well. "You seem different these days," she said. "I'm trying to be," he replied. "For myself, for you, and for the village." Adan smiled faintly. "Keep going. Change takes time, but you're getting there." Her words stayed with Okechukwu as he returned home. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, not because everything was resolved, but because he was no longer running from his past. He was facing it head-on, one day at a time. One evening, a fierce storm swept through the village, uprooting trees and damaging several homes, including Amoka's farm. The next morning, when the skies cleared, Okechukwu rushed to her aid. He found her standing amidst the wreckage, looking lost. "I help you rebuild," Okechukwu said, determination in his voice. Amoka nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude but also sorrow. "Thank you. But this is too much for one person to handle." Together, they began gathering the broken pieces, stacking what could be salvaged. Word quickly spread, and within hours, a small group of villagers arrived to assist. Among them was Adan, who wasted no time in getting to work. The community's response was overwhelming. It seemed the once skeptical villagers, witnessing Okechukwu's continued efforts, had decided to lend a hand. They saw him not as the man he once was, but as someone who had truly changed. For Okechukwu, it was a turning point. As he walked side by side with the villagers, he realized that this was the moment he had been waiting for, when his actions finally spoke louder than the rumors. Amoka, watching him coordinate the repairs with ease, smiled. "You've come a long way." "I couldn't have done it without you," Okechukwu replied. Adan, catching his eye from across the farm, gave him a slight nod. It was a simple gesture, but to Okechukwu, it meant more than words ever could. Days passed, and the village slowly returned to normal. Chief Nwofa, who had been observing Okechukwu's transformation from afar, decided it was time for a conversation. One morning, he approached Okechukwu while he was working on repairing a fence near the village square. "Okechukwu," the chief said, I've been watching you for some time now. You've been working hard, not just for yourself, but for the whole village. I see the difference in you. Okechukwu stood up, wiping his brow. I'm trying my best, Chief. Nwafa nodded. I know it's not easy to rebuild a reputation. The past can haunt us, but it doesn't define us unless we let it. You've chosen to let it go. And I respect that. I still have much to prove, Okechukwu admitted, but I'm not running from it anymore. I keep working until I've earned the trust of everyone I've wronged. The chief smiled. That's all anyone can ask of you. Keep going. And remember, no one can walk this path alone. You've got the support of your village now. Okechukwu felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The chief's words were more than just praise, they were a sign that the village was starting to accept him, not just as a changed man, but as a man worthy of respect. Just as Okechukwu thought the worst was behind him, an unexpected challenge arose. A young widow named Ngozi, new to the village, arrived with her young son. She had heard of Okechukwu's past and was immediately wary of him. One evening, as she was walking back from the market, she encountered Okechukwu near the village entrance. I've heard about you, Ngozi said, her voice cold. People say you've changed, but I'm not sure I believe it. Okechukwu nodded, understanding her skepticism. I can't ask you to trust me, but I can show you that I'm different. Ngozi eyed him suspiciously. I'll be watching. One mistake, and I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. Okechukwu knew this was the final test. If he wanted to prove to Ngozi, and to the rest of the village, that he had truly changed, he would have to be patient and unwavering in his actions. The following days, he kept his distance, choosing to help the other villagers with their work and avoid any situation where he might be misinterpreted. It wasn't easy, but he was determined. Weeks passed, and Ngozi's suspicion slowly began to fade. One day, as she was tending to her garden, Okechukwu approached her with a basket of freshly harvested vegetables. I've brought this for you, he said quietly. Ngozi took the basket, her eyes meeting his. I give you credit, Okechukwu. You've stayed true to your word. He smiled. I'm just trying to do what's right. From that day on, the village saw a new side of Okechukwu. His quiet actions spoke louder than any words could, and slowly, the villagers who once doubted him began to accept him. Amoka, Adan, and even Neka, who had once been his harshest critic, now greeted him with warmth. It wasn't that they had forgotten his past, but they had witnessed his efforts to atone for it. They understood that redemption wasn't about perfection, it was about the willingness to change. And as Okechukwu stood by the river one evening, watching the sunset, he knew that his journey was far from over. But for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his past lifting, replaced by the promise of a future built on trust, humility, and love.